In this episode, we're going to cover why Jesus is the healer, how atonement means to cover, and why Jesus is rejected.
All right.
So let's set the stage for Matthew chapters 8 and 9. Jesus has just performed the Sermon on the Mount, the ritual on top of the mountain. And this is how Matthew 8 starts off. In verse 1, it says, "When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him." So he's got this following. You can imagine there's probably a type of excitement over what is being launched here. Where previously, Jesus announced in the synagogue that he was the Messiah, he is now through ritual, through a performance, through an ordinance probably, announced the beginning of his church and his overall doctrine and teachings that he's going to be preaching throughout the Gospels, throughout the rest of his life. And so there's this excitement. All these people are following him. And here the authors, Matthew and Mark, now want to take from these teachings, this beginning, and want to show who he is. And what they focus on is that he is the healer. And so throughout chapters 8 and 9, we get several examples of Jesus healing different individuals. And this is important. It's not just a matter of, look at the power that Jesus has and he can go out and physically heal somebody. There's a reason why he is called the healer. First, the prophets in the Old Testament have all prophesied that Jesus was the healer, that the Messiah would come, that he would heal lepers, that he would heal the lame, he would heal the blind and the deaf, and cast out devils. And so this is, in a sense, making sure as a testimony in the Gospels that people understand that this is who this is, that the prophets have prophesied of the Messiah doing these things, and here is Jesus doing these things. So this is a testimony that Jesus is the Christ. That's the first reason. The second reason is that this is who he is. He is the healer. And we've mentioned before in a previous lesson that, as an example, in the earliest English translations, they did not give Jesus the name Jesus. They didn't use his name Jesus. They simply gave him the name of the healer, Heiland, because that was the understanding of who he is. More anciently, that was a bigger part of understanding that he was the healer. This is almost like a title that he would have had. And I'd like to go over this a little bit more so that we have an understanding of how healing is intertwined with the atonement and with covering. All right, so let's cover atonement here. Atonement comes from, it's an English word that came from William Tyndale or Tinsdale in the 1500s. And basically what he did is he took the term kippur, which is to cover in the Old Testament, and gave the word atonement. And atonement comes from a couple of different words that he put together. So you have at and one. So atonement is at one-ment. It's the same idea as covenant. It's taking two sides and having a reconciliation or bringing them together. That's what covenant means, right? Covenir would be to come together. That's a covenant. And so at one-ment is bringing God and man together. There is the higher law where God is coming down to men, condescending to men, and paying for man's sins, sacrificing for him. And then there is the lower law where man is reaching toward God to be at one with him by obedience and by prayer and by anything that's reaching upward toward God. So that's really what atonement means, is being at one. It has to do with covenant. But there's another meaning as well. And that has to do with covering. So Kippur, we think of the day Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish holiday, right? That is the Day of Atonement. Well, Yom Kippur really means Day of Covering. And Day of Covering is the same thing as atonement. So in the ritual of the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the temple, would go into the Holy of Holies, and would cleanse everything out with the blood of an ox and the blood of a goat and etc. And it would cleanse the temple and cleanse the land and cleanse the people and reconcile God with man. It was also called the covenant of peace. Sometimes it's termed. So it would be the covering of this with the blood. That would be the payment. You would cover. And we see this imagery throughout the scriptures as well of covering. For example, when Adam and Eve lose their garments of light, they lose their covering. They lose their kippur, the atonement in a sense. They lose that. And then when Jesus Christ, or Jehovah, makes garments of animal skins for Adam and Eve, he is giving them a covering, right? He's giving them a kippur. He's giving them atonement. It's a representation of atonement. Now, we use the term atonement also in the sense of a verb, to atone for someone, and that is also correct. It's a payment, to pay for somebody else, or to pay for a past sin of yourself. It's payment. And we can see that in a couple of other words. Also attributed to William Tinsdale is the term mercy seat. So in the Holy of Holies, you had the Ark of the Covenant. And what covered the Ark of the Covenant, the lid that had the two cherubim with the wings on them, that was called the kipperet, right? The covering. And so that would cover it. But it was also called, at least by William Tinsdale apparently, the mercy seat. Now think about the word mercy. We think of mercy as in the bowels of mercy and having compassion. But what does that really mean? What that means is you are paying for someone, right? You're paying the price of having empathy and suffering in behalf of somebody else. Think of the word mercenary. Mercenary would be a soldier who is paid by a different nation, usually, to come in and battle for them, to go to war for them. It's a payment. They're accepting payment as a soldier. Mercy, same thing, same term, word from where we get mercenary. So mercy is actually a payment. And so we have the law of justice, which is the lower law. Very important. But what supersedes that? It's the law of at-one-ment from God. It's the law of covering from God. It's the law of mercy from God. His mercy, His grace is a covering. And we think of His glory as something that covers us, garments of glory. The temple garment is a covering. And so when we are naked or ashamed, so to speak, it's because we've been separated from God. And as we are covered in holy raiment or of glory, then we are reconciled in a sense with God. There is a payment there. It is a covering. And that is atonement, at-one-ment. So then Jesus enters Capernaum, and there a Roman centurion approaches him and tells him that his servant is sick with the palsy. Palsy would be something of paralysis and maybe tremors, maybe much worse. And that he believes that Jesus, the healer, can heal his servant. So here we have the second example. We just had the leper to begin with at the beginning of the chapter. Now the second example of healing is a Roman. I think that's on purpose because we're showing that, okay, first, Jesus' mission here is to the Jews. And then it is also later to the Gentiles. In other words, it goes first to the house of Abraham, the house of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to their descendants, and then it comes out to the Gentiles. And so this is a foreshadowing of where the gospel will go. They're preaching first in Jerusalem and throughout Judah, and it's going to go throughout the world with the Gentiles. And so this is an announcement again of his messiahship, of his Melchizedek priesthood, and of the fullness of the gospel, that it will fill the earth, including all of the Gentiles, and not just the Jews there. So this would have been something kind of important as an announcement to the Jews there locally and to his disciples. I am healing a Gentile. And this is an important thing, and this is a foreshadowing of the atonement which heals all people. And this is not just for the house of David. This is not just for the house of Abraham. This is for all people, all Gentiles. And this centurion tells Jesus, look, I have a lot of authority, and I can tell people where to go when they go. I tell them to go left, they go left. Tell them to go right, they go right, something to that effect. But he says, but I'm not worthy to even enter this house with you as you go in to heal the servant. I know that you will be able to do this. You can just speak the words, and this will happen. And this is similar to what we saw with the leper. And this is a principle we get throughout these 2 chapters here about those that are being healed. And let's follow through on that as we go through some of these examples. And in the next episode, we'll cover a little bit more about the other half of the healing that Jesus performs here. And after the words of the centurion to him, showing this faith, then Jesus says, and I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west. That means outside of Judah, right? Outside of the covenant people, so to speak, and shall sit down with Abraham. This is a big part of, for example, what President Nelson talks about right now, about the Abrahamic covenant and how we are all to be working toward this, and that the Gentiles are very, very much included in this. He says, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom, and I believe he's talking about the kingdom of Judah here, so the covenant people here, shall be cast out into outer darkness. He's talking about some of them would probably be cast out, because just because of your lineage, that doesn't guarantee you anything, right? It is about whether you are following the principles that he is going to be teaching here for the next few years. And then we get an example here of the casting out of devils. And I don't want to go a lot into this, but this to me is a sign that's showing that what we're going to see here in the next chapter. And that is that Jesus is not here just to heal you physically. That's not the focus here. It is important, and it's a sign to show that he is the healer. But the focus really is that he will heal your spirit. And then it says, after he has cast out the devils, that he heals all that are sick in Capernaum. So everybody is bringing people here to the healer. So think about that again, the healer. This is a major part of what he is doing throughout his ministry. And people are coming from all sides, all corners of being able to travel there, and they're bringing their people there. Think of the hope that would be there. They hear about Jesus and what he has been doing. Think of the hope if you had a child, for example, that was struck with a disease, or a mother or a relative or a best friend or whatever, or yourself. And this hope, like, what? This has happened. I've heard about this. And there's this, I would think, this surgence of just this hope for these people that somebody can heal them. And we can, of course, translate that into a spiritual idea as well, which is more important. We'll get to that later. And while he's in Capernaum, a scribe comes to him and says, Master, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, well, the problem is that I don't have anywhere to lay my head. I have nowhere to be, that I have no home. I've got to go about and do my business. And this is the first point here of the next few points, where he's saying that there are a lot of things that are important out there, but this is the most important thing. So these other things, again, in that values hierarchy, they're not as important. Don't worry as much about those as aiming for the top, aiming for the most important thing, the greatest truth and the greatest purpose. And after the scribe, then there comes a disciple to him who says, I want to follow you, but first I need to go bury my father. Well, that's a pretty important thing, right? He loves his father. He wants to make sure he's there at his burial. But here, there's a point being made by the author. right? The point is, and by Jesus, the point is, that is really important. Good for you. But he says to the disciple, follow me and let the dead bury the dead. In other words, you need life. You need eternal life. And this is the most important thing. That's pretty important to bury your father. That's a really important thing. Good for you for holding a high principle. But here is something even more important. And then lastly, they go into the ship and they go out and there's a great storm, a tempest. And the disciples are like all worried that they're about to perish. And Jesus is asleep. And I think this is a poignant moment here because, again, this is emphasizing that Jesus is not concerned about these physical things. He's not concerned about these lower things. Not that it wouldn't be important, but again, I think the message here is that of all these important things, disasters, your family even, a home, all of these things that might be really important, they're not as important as what I am bringing here, and you need to see that. I think that's his message to them. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we can hold on to some very important things, and they can be our main purpose in life. And then if something comes along that is even more important, it might be really hard for us to let go of whatever it is that we have already grabbed onto and say, okay, this is now more important, right? This becomes more important. We see this as we grow into adulthood and become a parent and a spouse. Some things that would have been really important to us and good things probably aren't as important anymore. We need to move beyond that and graduate to a higher value where now our spouse and our children become more important. And we bring this additional value that comes in and actually sits now at the top. And our purpose now is aimed up at that new higher value. And that's what Jesus is bringing in. That's a focus of, again, the higher and the lower laws, where this focus has been the law of Moses, the law of sacrifice, looking forward to something else. He is that something else. And so the principle is there can be new and better and more important things that come on in our lives, and we need to learn to be able to lower important things for other things that are even more important. I think we have a hard time sometimes doing that. I know I've experienced that. And then at the end of the chapter, it's very interesting what happens. He's gone out and he has healed all of these people. And yet, at the end of the chapter, verse 34, it says, "And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they besought him that he would depart out of their coasts." So basically, thank you very much, but get out of Dodge. Very interesting, isn't it, that this happens? The disruption that Jesus is causing here. Maybe all these people are coming in. Maybe it's bothering people. Maybe the leaders of the Jewish community there in Capernaum are not very happy about what's happening. But regardless, here we have another principle. So he has a little bit of this element right from the get-go of being a stranger in a strange land. And going back to the beginning of his life, he's born in a cave, probably a cave, in Bethlehem, in very humble circumstances. And then Herod tries to kill him and has all the young boy babies killed. And he has to run off to Egypt and then come back. And here he is in his own area, his own region of Galilee, and he's being kicked out again. He's being rejected, even though he's doing something that is phenomenal, obviously, because it's a threat to people. It's a threat to the status quo. It's a threat to power structures. And maybe it's just a threat to understanding for some people of what is happening. And so this disruption, as good as it is being thrown out. And I wonder sometimes if we do that in our lives, where Again, we're looking for a goodness, kind of like Christ with the ship and with the scribe and the disciple, where we're hanging on to something that might be important to us. And here comes something better and a higher value to shoot for and to follow and to hang on to. And yet we don't want to let go of what we already have in place. The status quo is maybe sometimes too comfortable for us. So Jesus, as the promised Messiah, as the healer, as the King of the Jews, the new Melchizedek, is also rejected as all of those things among the masses. We'll talk to you next time.